March 14, 2024. A quiet suburban neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. Michael Torres had been standing in the backyard of the modest ranch-style house he'd inherited from his father 6 months earlier, watching the excavation crew prepare the ground for a swimming pool installation. It was supposed to be a straightforward renovation project: dig the hole, install the pool, increase the property value before selling. The house had been in Michael's family since 1965, when his father, Anthony, had purchased it as a 19-year-old mechanic, starting his life in Chicago. Anthony had raised Michael there after Michael's mother had died of cancer when Michael was 7. The house held 59 years of family memories, but now, with Anthony gone and Michael living across town with his own family, it was time to let it go. The landscaping company's backhoe had been digging for approximately 20 minutes, removing the top layer of soil and grass from what would become the pool area. Michael had been reviewing paperwork with the project manager when one of the workers had shouted for them to stop. "Boss, we hit something," the backhoe operator had called out, backing the machine away from the excavation site. "Feels solid, but it's not rock. I think it's brick." Michael and the project manager had approached the shallow excavation, barely 5 feet deep at this point, and looked down at what the bucket had scraped. Red brick, old brick, arranged in what appeared to be a curved pattern, suggesting a structure rather than random debris. Probably an old foundation or cistern, the project manager had suggested. Houses this age sometimes had underground storage. "We'll dig around it carefully, see what we're dealing with." Over the next hour, as workers used hand tools to carefully expose more of the structure, it had become clear this was neither a foundation nor a cistern. It was a chamber, a deliberately constructed underground room made of brick, approximately 13 feet long by 20 feet wide, with walls that appeared to extend at least 6 feet below ground level. And it had a door, a heavy steel door set into one wall, sealed from the outside with rusted but intact padlocks that had clearly been locked for decades. Michael had felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This wasn't normal. This wasn't an old storage cellar or utility structure. This was something that had been deliberately hidden, deliberately sealed, and had remained secret beneath his family's backyard for God only knows how long. He'd called 911 immediately. The Chicago Police Department had responded within 30 minutes, followed shortly by detectives from the Major Case Unit. When Michael had explained what had been found, the ranking detective, a veteran investigator named Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, had ordered the excavation site secured and called for additional resources. By late afternoon, using hydraulic tools, investigators had cut through the rusted locks and forced open the heavy steel door. What they'd found inside had been beyond anything Michael could have imagined. A scene preserved by time and sealed environment, waiting to reveal a secret that had remained hidden for 61 years. The underground chamber was approximately 13 feet by 20 feet, with brick walls rising about 6.5 feet from the floor to a brick ceiling. The air inside was dry and stale, undisturbed for decades. And in that sealed space sat a vehicle, a 1963 Cadillac Eldorado convertible in pale blue, covered in decades of dust, but otherwise in remarkably good condition given its bizarre resting place. But it was what else was in the chamber that had made Lieutenant Martinez immediately call for forensic teams and the coroner's office. Against one wall, heavy chains had been mounted into the brick with iron rings at their ends, restraints that could have been used to bind someone. Scattered on the floor were empty tin cans, Campbell's Soup, Chef Boyardee, brands that still existed, but in packaging styles that hadn't been used since the 1960s. An empty glass bottle that had once contained water, a metal bucket in one corner that had clearly served as a makeshift latrine, and on the floor, near the sealed door, as if the person had been trying to reach it even in their final moments, lay partially mummified human remains. The body was still clothed in what had once been an expensive suit, now deteriorated but still recognizable as men's fashion from the early 1960s. The skeletal hands showed broken nipple nails and scratch marks on the finger bones, evidence that whoever had died here had tried desperately to claw their way out. The forensic examination would take days, but the initial assessment was clear. Someone had been imprisoned in this underground chamber and had died there, sealed away from the world. The dry, stable environment had prevented complete decomposition, leaving the remains in a state of partial mummification that would allow for identification and analysis. Dental records would eventually provide that identification, and when they did, they would reveal something impossible. The remains belonged to Vincent "Vinnie" Marcelli, a low-level associate of the Chicago outfit, who had been reported missing on February 16, 1963, 61 years, 3 weeks, and 27 days earlier. And the house above this underground tomb? It had been purchased by Michael's father, Anthony Torres, in March of 1965, 2 years after Vincent Marcelli's disappearance, and 2 years after he'd apparently been sealed alive in this brick chamber to die in darkness and isolation. The previous owner, according to property records that police would examine in detail, had been Samuel "Sammy" Red Giordano, a known capo in the Chicago outfit, who'd sold the property quickly and moved to Las Vegas shortly after Marcelli's disappearance, a move that had raised no suspicions at the time. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in February 1963 involves organized crime, a brutal execution method known as the living tomb, and a family secret that may have remained hidden for nearly 60 decades. By the end, you will understand what Vincent Marcelli's final days must have been like, and you'll be left wondering the same question that haunts Michael Torres. Did his father really live for 59 years without knowing what was buried beneath his backyard? Or did Anthony Torres take a terrible secret to his grave? Michael Anthony Torres was 35 years old in March 2024, a high school history teacher living in Oak Park with his wife Rachel and their 2 young daughters. He'd been born and raised in the modest ranch house on the northwest side of Chicago, living there until he'd left for college at 18. The house had been his entire childhood, the backyard where he'd played, the garage where his father had taught him to work on cars, the kitchen where his father had made dinner every night after Michael's mother had died. Anthony James Torres had passed away in September 2023, age 76, after a brief bout with pneumonia. Anthony had been a mechanic his entire working life, spending 40 years at the Same independent auto shop in Chicago before retiring in 2015. He'd been known as honest, hard-working, and exceptionally skilled with engines, the kind of mechanic people trusted completely and returned to year after year. Anthony had been born in 1946 in a small town in southern Illinois, the son of Mexican immigrants who'd worked in agriculture. He'd moved to Chicago in 1964 at age 18, looking for better opportunities than the farming life offered. Within a year, he'd found work as a mechanic's apprentice and had saved enough money to make a down payment on the house, an achievement that seemed remarkable for a 19-year-old with no family wealth or connections. That house purchase in March 1965 had been a source of pride for Anthony throughout his life. He'd often told Michael the story, how he'd worked 2 jobs to save the down payment, how the previous owner was willing to accept a lower price for a quick sale, how Anthony had seen it as his chance to establish himself and build a future in Chicago. Anthony had met Michael's mother, Maria Gonzalez, in 1972. They'd married in 1973, and Michael had been born in 1989. Maria had died of breast cancer in 1996, when Michael was only 7. Anthony had raised Michael alone after that, working long hours at the shop, but always making time for his son, helping with homework, teaching him to work on cars, attending every school event and sports game. Michael's memories of his father were of a quiet, gentle man who loved old cars, classic rock music, and spending Sunday afternoons working in the garage. Anthony had never spoken of involvement with anything criminal. He'd never displayed wealth beyond what his mechanic's salary could explain. He lived modestly, saved carefully, and had left Michael a small but respectable inheritance. The house, some savings, and a collection of vintage car parts that Anthony had accumulated over decades. The house itself had been Anthony's castle. He'd maintained it meticulously over 59 years, updating the kitchen and bathrooms in the 1980s, re-roofing in the 1990s, keeping everything in good repair through careful attention and his own skilled labor. He loved the backyard, where he'd build Michael a treehouse and later a basketball hoop. He hadn't returned by morning. She'd been worried, but not immediately panicked. Vincent's work sometimes required unexpected absences. But when he hadn't returned by the following evening, and when his closest associates had claimed not to know where he was, Diane had reported him missing to the Chicago police. His Chevrolet had been found abandoned near a bar in Cicero, a suburb known as Outfit Territory, with no signs of struggle or evidence of what had happened to him. The investigation had been perfunctory. In 1963 Chicago, when a known outfit associate disappeared, police generally assumed mob business was involved and didn't investigate too aggressively. The case had been filed as a missing person and had gradually gone cold. Diane had been left to raise their daughter alone, living on savings and eventually remarrying in 1968. Vincent's disappearance had remained a mystery to his family and to the few associates who'd cared enough to wonder. The prevailing theory had been that he'd been killed by a rival faction or had been executed for some betrayal or mistake. No one had imagined that he'd been buried alive in a sealed chamber beneath a suburban house, left to die slowly over days or weeks of unimaginable suffering. And no one had connected his disappearance to Samuel "Sammy" Giordano, the outfit capo who'd owned that suburban house. Sammy Red had been a mid-level but well-established figure in the Chicago outfit in the early 1960s. Born Salvatore Giordano in February 1922, he'd earned his nickname from his red hair and volatile temper. By the early 60s, he'd been in his 40s, established in the organization's hierarchy and wealthy from decades of illegal activities, including gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. Giordano had purchased the house on Chicago's northwest side in 1959, using it as a residence for a mistress rather than his primary home. The property had been in his name, but he'd rarely been seen there, preferring his main residence closer to the city center. The house had been convenient, unremarkable, and had attracted no particular attention from law enforcement. In March 1965, just over 2 years after Vincent Marcelli's disappearance, Giordano had sold the house quickly to Anthony Torres for what had been described in the deed as a fair but not suspiciously low price. Giordano had then moved to Las Vegas, where he'd lived until his death from a heart attack in February 1987. He'd never been connected to Marcelli's disappearance, and the sale of the Chicago house had been seen as simply a real estate transaction. But now, 61 years later, the discovery of Vincent Marcelli's remains beneath that property raised terrible questions. Had Giordano killed Marcelli personally or ordered his execution? Had the underground chamber been built specifically to create a living tomb, a torture method known to be used occasionally by organized crime to make examples of those who'd betrayed the organization? And most troubling for Michael Torres, had his father known what was buried beneath the house he'd purchased? Friday, February 15, 1963. Chicago had been gripped by a particularly brutal winter, with temperatures hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit and snowbanks lining the streets from storms that had passed through in previous weeks. Vincent Marcelli had spent the day as he usually did, making rounds to businesses that owed protection payments to the outfit, collecting money and delivering messages from his superiors about expectations and consequences. Vincent had returned to the apartment he shared with Diane and their 6-year-old daughter Angela around 5 p.m. Diane had been preparing dinner, meatballs and pasta, Vincent's favorite, while Angela had been playing with dolls in the living room. Vincent had seemed tense, Diane would later tell police, more nervous than usual. When she'd asked if everything was okay, he'd said he had an important meeting that evening and couldn't talk about it. Around 6:30 p.m., Vincent had changed from his work clothes into one of his better suits, a dark blue wool suit he usually reserved for more formal outfit business. He'd shaved again, combed his hair carefully with pomade, and had put on his best shoes. Diane had recognized these preparations as signs that Vincent was meeting with someone important in the organization. "Who are you meeting with?" Diane had asked, though she'd known Vincent usually wouldn't answer questions about his work. "Some higher-ups," Vincent had replied, which had been more information than he usually shared. "Nothing to worry about. I should be home by midnight." He'd kissed Diane goodbye, told Angela to be good for her mother, and had left the apartment around 7 p.m. Diane had watched from their third-floor window as Vincent had walked to where his 1961 Chevrolet Impala was parked on the street, brushed snow off the windshield, and driven away into the winter darkness. That had been the last time Diane Marcelli had seen her husband alive. What happened to Vincent that evening had only been reconstructed 61 years later based on forensic evidence, the location where his car was found, and knowledge of how the outfit had operated during that era. The details remained partially speculative, but the general sequence of events became clear once his remains were discovered. Vincent had driven from his South Side apartment towards Cicero, a suburb immediately west of Chicago that had been essentially controlled by the outfit since the Prohibition era. His destination had almost certainly been a meeting place designated by whoever had summoned him, possibly a restaurant, a social club, or one of the many businesses that served as outfit fronts. But the meeting was a setup. Whether Vincent had been lured under false pretenses, or whether he'd known he was in trouble and went anyway out of obligation or fear, he'd driven directly into a trap. Somewhere in Cicero, probably shortly after arriving, Vincent had been grabbed by outfit enforcers. His car had been abandoned in a parking lot near a bar in Cicero, found by police 3 days later with the keys still in the ignition. No signs of struggle, no evidence of what had happened to its owner. Vincent himself had been taken to the house on Chicago's northwest side, the house owned by Sammy Red Giordano, the house that would eventually become Anthony Torres's family home. In the backyard of that house, probably constructed weeks or months earlier specifically for this purpose, was the underground brick chamber. The chamber itself had been built with care. Brick walls, a brick ceiling strong enough to support the weight of the soil that would be piled on top of it, a heavy steel door that could be sealed from the outside. It had been designed to be both a tomb and a torture method, a place where someone could be kept alive long enough to suffer before dying of dehydration or starvation. The 1963 Cadillac Eldorado found in the chamber suggested a particular cruel irony. The Eldorado was a status symbol, an expensive luxury car that represented the wealth and power that came with high position in the outfit. Putting it in Vincent's tomb might have been a message. This is what you wanted. This is what you thought you could have, and now you'll die surrounded by it, but unable to enjoy it. Vincent had been chained to the wall. The heavy chains and iron rings had been securely mounted into the brick. Food and water had been left for him, but clearly not enough or not replenished. The empty cans scattered on the floor told a story of desperation. Campbell's soup cans, opened crudely, probably with bare hands or against the brick walls, since no can opener had been found. The empty water bottles showed he'd been given something to drink, but not enough to sustain life indefinitely. The broken fingernails and scratch marks on his skeletal hand bones revealed his final desperation. Vincent had clawed at the brick walls, at the steel door, trying somehow to break through or alert someone to his presence. But the chamber had been buried under 5 feet of dirt and covered with grass. No one could have heard him screaming. No one would have known he was there. Forensic analysis would later estimate that Vincent had survived in the chamber somewhere between 7 to 10 days before dying of dehydration and exposure. The February cold had probably penetrated underground, and while the sealed chamber protected him from freezing, the temperatures would have been uncomfortably low. Combined with limited food and water, the stress and the psychological horror of being buried alive, Vincent's death had likely come as a relief. His body had been positioned near the door when discovered, suggesting his final moments had been spent still trying to escape, still hoping somehow that the door would open and he'd be released. But it never had. The door had remained sealed until March 14, 2024, 61 years, 3 weeks, and 27 days after Vincent Marcelli had been condemned to his living tomb. Outfit had needed to dispose of a vehicle that might have been connected to criminal activities, and sealing it underground had been one way to make it disappear permanently. The timing of the ED murder, February 1963, had coincided with a period of significant activity and conflict within the Chicago outfit. Federal investigations had been increasing pressure on the organization. Internal power struggles had led to violence and disappearances. Vincent had been one casualty among many during that turbulent period. The sale of the property to Anthony Torres in March 1965 had raised questions that investigators couldn't definitively answer. The transaction itself had appeared normal: standard purchase price, conventional mortgage, proper documentation. But why that property? Why that buyer? Why that timing? Several theories had emerged, none provable. The random purchase theory suggested Anthony had simply been looking to buy a house at the same time Giordano had decided to sell, and they'd connected through normal real estate channels. This had been the most likely explanation, but also the least satisfying, because it meant the coincidence was just that, coincidence. The deliberate selection theory suggested Giordano had specifically chosen to sell to someone with no connections to organized crime as a way of distancing the property from its criminal past. A young mechanic from downstate Illinois would have been exactly the kind of buyer who'd never ask questions and would never have reason to know about the property's history. The facilitated sale theory suggested that someone had helped arrange the sale, perhaps someone connected to both Giordano and Anthony in ways that left no documentary evidence. This theory had been the most troubling because it implied Anthony might have been less innocent than he'd appeared. Investigators had examined every aspect of Anthony Torres's life, looking for connections to organized crime. They'd reviewed his employment history, his financial records, his social connections, his activities over 59 years. They'd found nothing. Anthony had been exactly what he'd appeared to be, a working-class mechanic who'd bought a house, raised a family, and lived an honest life. But investigators had also acknowledged that absence of evidence didn't prove Anthony had been completely ignorant of the chamber beneath his property. It was possible, though unprovable, that he'd known about the tomb and had chosen to ignore it, to live his life as if it didn't exist, to keep the secret from everyone, including his son. If Anthony had known, he'd kept the secret perfectly. He'd never given any indication through words or actions that he'd been carrying knowledge of a murder. He'd maintained the property for decades without ever accidentally revealing what lay beneath the backyard. He'd raised Michael there without apparently fearing that his son might someday discover the terrible secret. For Michael Torres, the ambiguity had been agonizing. He'd been left with two possible versions of his father's story, both painful in different ways. In one version, Anthony had been completely innocent, a young man who'd worked hard to buy his first house, who'd gotten lucky with a seller willing to accept his offer, and who'd lived there for 59 years, never knowing what was buried beneath his backyard. This version meant Anthony had been a victim of circumstances, unlucky to have purchased property with such a terrible history. In the other version, Anthony had known about the chamber and its contents. Perhaps he'd been told when he'd purchased the property. Perhaps he'd discovered it later and had chosen to keep it secret. This version meant Anthony had lived for decades tarrying the knowledge of a murder, had raised his son literally on top of a tomb, and had taken the secret to his grave. Michael had wanted desperately to believe the first version, but he'd been honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the second version was possible. The doubt had been corrosive, poisoning his memories of his father and his childhood. The property itself had become unsellable in any normal sense. After the remains had been removed and the investigation had been completed, Michael had been left with a house that was now infamous. The media coverage had been extensive. Murder tomb discovered in Chicago suburb. Mob victim found after 61 years. House of secrets reveals organized crime's dark past. No one wanted to buy a house where a man had been buried alive and had died in agony. No one wanted to live on property associated with such horror. The house had become a curiosity, a tourist attraction for crime enthusiasts and murder hobbyists who drive by to take photos. Michael had eventually donated the property to the city of Chicago, which had razed the house and converted the land to a small memorial park. A plaque had been installed commemorating Vincent Marcelli and acknowledging the tragedy that had occurred there. The underground chamber had been filled with concrete and sealed permanently. Angela Hendrickson had been able to give her father a proper burial 61 years after his death. Vincent's remains were cremated and interred in a cemetery in Chicago with a headstone that gave his full name and dates. Vincent, Vinnie Marcelli, 1931-1963. The inscription added, "Beloved husband and father, finally at rest." The funeral had been attended by Angela, her children and grandchildren, a few elderly former associates of Vincent who'd still been alive, and Michael Torres, who'd felt compelled to pay respects to the man who'd lain beneath his childhood home. The case had officially been closed as a murder with the prime suspect, Sammy Red Giordano, deceased and beyond prosecution. The FBI had noted the case as part of the historical record of Chicago outfit activities, but had indicated there would be no further investigation since all likely perpetrators were long dead. For the Chicago Police Department, the resolution of a 61-year-old missing persons case had been a significant closure. For the ET historians and researchers who studied organized crime, it had provided a grim example of the outfit's brutality. For the public, it had been a sensational story that had dominated news cycles for weeks before fading from attention. But for Michael Torres and Angela Hendrickson, the discovery had created wounds that would never fully heal. Michael had been left with permanent doubt about his father's innocence and with the knowledge that his entire childhood had literally been built on top of a tomb. Angela had been given closure about her father's fate, but had learned that his death had been far more horrible than she had ever imagined. The story of Vincent Marcelli's murder and the decades his remains had lain hidden illustrated the long shadows that crimes could cast. 61 years after his death, Vincent's murder was still creating victims. His daughter, who'd learned the awful truth, the son who'd discovered the tomb, and perhaps most tragically, the uncertain legacy of Anthony Torres, a man who might have been innocent or who might have carried a terrible secret to his grave. Some questions would never be answered. Did Anthony know what was beneath his property? If he knew, why did he keep the secret? If he didn't know, how did he end up purchasing that specific house from that specific seller? These mysteries would remain unsolved, adding a final layer of tragedy to a story already saturated with suffering and loss. Vincent Marcelli had been found after 61 years, but the complete truth about his murder and its aftermath had died with the people who'd known it, leaving only fragments, speculation, and the haunting possibility that sometimes the secrets we think we know about the people closest to us are incomplete at best and entirely wrong at worst. The ground beneath our feet, Michael Torres had learned, can hold secrets we never imagined. And sometimes those secrets emerge to shatter everything we thought we knew about our history, our families, and ourselves.
Associates, other low-level outfit members who'd worked with him or who might have known about his activities. These interviews had been uniformly unproductive. No one had seen Vincent on Friday night. No one had known about any meeting. No one had any information about where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. This wall of silence had been typical of investigations involving organized crime. The outfit's code of silence, Omera, had been strictly enforced, and talking to police about internal outfit business could result in severe consequences. Even if someone had known what happened to Vincent Marcelli, they wouldn't have shared that information with investigators. The investigation had also examined Vincent's financial records, looking for evidence that he might have been skimming money from the outfit or engaging in unauthorized activities that could have motivated his murder. The records had been unremarkable. Vincent had lived within his means, had no suspicious bank accounts, showed no signs of sudden wealth or unusual expenses. Within a month, the investigation had stalled completely. Without witnesses, without evidence, without cooperation from anyone in Vincent's social circle, detectives had had nothing to work with. The case had been classified as a missing person investigation with suspected foul play, and it had joined the files of dozens of other unsolved disappearances linked to organized crime. Diane Marcelli had been left to manage without her husband's income, relying on savings and eventually taking a job as a secretary to support herself and Angela. Some of Vincent's associates had helped her financially for a while, not out of generosity, but because the outfit traditionally took care of the families of members who died or disappeared in service to the organization. But that help had been modest and had eventually stopped. Diane had never learned what had happened to her husband. She'd eventually accepted that he was dead, though she'd had no body to bury and no grave to visit. In 1968, she'd remarried, a legitimate businessman who'd known nothing about her first husband's connections and had tried to build a normal life for Angela. Angela Marcelli had grown up with fragmented memories of her father and a mother who'd spoken little about him. She'd eventually changed her last name to her stepfather's surname, distancing herself from the Marcelli identity and the organized crime associations it carried. She lived a quiet, ordinary life, married, had children of her own, and had rarely thought about the father who disappeared when she was 6 years old. By 2024, Angela was 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher living in a suburb of Minneapolis. She'd put her father's disappearance behind her decades earlier, assuming he'd been killed in some mob dispute and that his body had been disposed of in ways that ensured it would never be found. Lake Michigan, a construction site, a landfill, anywhere that organized crime typically buried their secrets. She'd never imagined that her father had spent his final days buried alive beneath a suburban Chicago backyard, or that his tomb would remain undiscovered for 61 years until a man renovating his inherited property had decided to install a swimming pool. The property records that police would examine after the discovery told their own story. Sammy Red Giordano had purchased the house on Chicago's northwest side in July 1959 for $23,000, a reasonable price for the era and neighborhood. He'd registered it in his own name, making no attempt to hide his ownership, suggesting he'd used it for legitimate, if secondary, purposes. The house had been unremarkable, a ranch-style home built in the mid-1950s, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a modest backyard. Property tax records showed Giordano had maintained the property and paid all obligations promptly. There had been no police calls to the address, no complaints from neighbors, nothing to draw official attention. The B underground chamber had presumably been constructed sometime between 1959, when Giordano had purchased the property, and February 1963, when Vincent Marcelli had been sealed inside it. Building such a structure would have required significant effort. Excavating the hole, laying the brick walls and ceiling, installing the steel door, backfilling and landscaping to hide all evidence of the construction. Giordano had likely used outfit-connected contractors for the work, people who'd ask no questions and who'd keep quiet about unusual projects. The 1950s and 60s had been an era when Chicago's construction industry had been heavily infiltrated by organized crime, making it easy for connected individuals to get questionable work done discreetly. After Vincent Marcelli's disappearance, Giordano had continued to own the property for approximately 2 years. Then, in March 1965, he'd sold it to Anthony Torres for $27,000 and had moved to Las Vegas. The timing of the sale, 2 years after Marcelli's death, suggested careful planning. Selling immediately after sealing someone alive beneath your property would have been suspicious. Waiting 2 years had allowed time to pass, had let any investigations cool, and had created enough distance that the sale appeared simply to be a real estate transaction, rather than an attempt to distance oneself from a crime scene. But why had Giordano sold to Anthony Torres specifically? That question would haunt Michael Torres as he tried to understand his father's role in this nightmare. Had it been random? Anthony had simply been looking to buy a house at the time Giordano had wanted to sell? Or had there been some connection between them, some reason Giordano had chosen Anthony as the buyer? Anthony's background offered no obvious answers. In March 1965, he'd been a 19-year-old mechanic's apprentice from downstate Illinois who'd been living in Chicago for less than a year. He'd had no known connections to organized crime, no criminal record, no obvious links to Sammy Red Giordano or the outfit. But he'd somehow managed to buy a house at 19, an achievement that seemed remarkable for a working-class teenager with no family wealth. Had someone helped him? Had the purchase been facilitated or financed in ways that didn't appear in official records? Or had Anthony simply been an exceptionally dedicated saver who'd worked multiple jobs and lived frugally to achieve his dream of home ownership? These questions remain unanswered, and with Anthony dead, they likely would stay that way forever. The 61 years between Vincent Marcelli's entombment and the discovery of his remains in March 2024 saw the world transform in ways that would have been unimaginable to a man dying in an underground chamber in the early 1960s. The Chicago outfit that had killed Vincent would decline dramatically, its power broken by federal prosecutions and changing times. The city itself would evolve, neighborhoods changing character, old mob territories becoming gentrified suburbs. And through all those years, Anthony had lived in the house, raised his son, worked as a mechanic, and had apparently never questioned the ground beneath his feet. Anthony's life from 1965 to 2023 had been, by all accounts, remarkably ordinary. He'd worked hard, lived modestly, and had been known to everyone as honest and reliable. His co-workers at the auto shop had trusted him completely. He'd been the kind of mechanic who'd tell customers honestly what needed to be fixed and what could wait, who'd do quality work for fair prices, who'd never cheat or cut corners. His neighbors had known him as quiet and friendly, the kind of person who'd wave hello, who'd help jumpstart your car if needed, who'd keep his property neat and wouldn't cause problems. He'd served on the neighborhood association board in the 1980s and had organized an annual block party for several years. After Maria's death in 1996, Anthony had focused his life entirely on raising Michael. He'd attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game. He'd helped Michael with homework, taught him to drive, advised him about college choices. Friends and family had admired how dedicated he'd been to single parenthood. Michael's memories of growing up in the house were entirely positive. The house had been his whole world as a child. The bedroom where he'd read comics and done homework, the living room where they'd watched TV with his dad, the backyard where they'd played catch, and where Michael had learned to maintain a lawnmower and tend a garden. That backyard had been Anthony's pride. He'd spent countless hours maintaining it, mowing in neat diagonal patterns, trimming edges with precision, keeping the grass green and healthy. He'd built Michael a treehouse in the old oak tree when Michael was 8, spending weekends on the construction and making it sturdy and safe. He'd installed a basketball hoop when Michael was 12, pouring concrete for the base and mounting the backboard securely. All of that time,
All of those ordinary family activities had taken place directly above Vincent Marcelli's tomb. When Michael had played in the yard as a child, he'd been running over ground that contained a man who died in imaginable horror. When Anthony had mowed the lawn every Saturday, he'd been maintaining grass that grew in soil placed over a sealed underground chamber. When they'd sat in lawn chairs on summer evenings and talked about life, they'd been resting, literally, on top of a crime scene. Had Anthony known? That was the question that would torment Michael after the discovery. Had his father lived for 59 years carrying this terrible secret, knowing that beneath his property lay the body of a murdered man? Or had Anthony truly been innocent, an unwitting buyer who'd purchased a house without knowing its horrific secret? The evidence supporting Anthony's innocence was substantial.